He was sprawled on the sidewalk, his head slammed against a lamppost, blood seeping down and staining the collar of his white shirt. No one around, no one screamed, only the soft drizzle tapping on the pavement, and her, standing there, heart pounding, not knowing what to do first, save a life or save the only job she had left. Avery Morgan had never imagined she'd see someone collapse right before her eyes, especially not on a morning like this. Wet, gray, and filled with the kind of small worries that slowly eat away at every ounce of patience she had. The number 14 bus she took every morning had been sitting motionless at the stop for nearly 20 minutes because of an accident up the street. The driver didn't bother to explain anything beyond a helpless shrug. Avery stepped off just as the clock on her phone hit 7:43. She pulled her worn, second-hand jacket tight, tugged the hood over her head, and started to run. Her shift started at 8, and Mrs. Christine never tolerated lateness. Not once. Down the side street leading to the bookstore, Avery passed shuttered windows, a few coffee shops flickering to life, their light blurring through rain-streaked glass. Each step felt heavier than usual. Her canvas shoes had soaked through long ago. As she turned the corner, she froze. A man lay on the wet pavement, his body stiff as if frozen mid-fall. The way he'd landed, head smashed against the lamppost, legs twisted beneath him, one hand still gripping a phone with a shattered screen, made her heart lurch. Avery checked her watch. 7:52. 8 minutes left to run past 2 blocks and 1 intersection. She clenched her jaw, hesitating. In her head, Mrs. Christine's voice echoed, "If you're even 1 minute late again, don't bother coming back." But then Avery stepped closer. Not because she was some kind of saint. She'd often thought that if she ever collapsed in the middle of the street, no one would stop for her either. And maybe that was exactly why she couldn't walk away now. "Sir?" she called softly, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. She knelt beside him and gently shook his shoulder. Blood oozed from a cut above his temple, not deep, but still bleeding. His face was streaked with rain and dirt, and his once white shirt had turned a patchy gray. He groaned faintly. His trembling hand reached for the phone, then slipped, letting it fall from his grasp. "Don't call an ambulance." His voice was barely a whisper, laced with fear. Avery frowned, confused. Why would someone injured react like that? "You can't stay here, sir. You fell. You need medical attention," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. She'd taken a mandatory first aid course back at the orphanage. At least she knew how to keep a head injury stable. The man slowly opened his eyes. They were ash gray, unfocused. "I just need to sit up for a moment," he muttered. Avery helped him sit up, propping his back against the lamppost. Her hands trembled from the cold and worry. She rummaged through her pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of tissues, pressing it gently to his wound. Then she dug out a peppermint and a small bottle of water she always carried, handing them to him. He took a sip, then exhaled shakily. She glanced at her watch, 7:58. Her heart felt pulled in 2 directions. If she ran now, she might only be a few minutes late. But if something worse happened to him, she knew she'd never forgive herself. Avery sighed and pulled out her phone. "Should I call an ambulance?" The man shook his head, eyes closing again. "No hospital, just let me rest for a bit." Avery didn't know why, but she believed him. Maybe it was the exhaustion in his eyes. Maybe it was because she understood that feeling, the one where you just don't want anyone to see you broken. A cold gust swept through, carrying the damp scent of rain and concrete. Avery sat beside him, slipping her backpack behind his back as a cushion. She took off her jacket and draped it over his trembling shoulders. He looked like a stranger who'd stumbled out of a terrible day, and honestly, so did she. In that moment, on an empty street, the two of them, strangers, both bruised and bent in their own ways, sat side by side in silence, as if the world had forgotten them both. 7:59. Avery knew exactly what was waiting for her at the bookstore, but she stayed. 1 minute, 2 minutes, until the man was able to stand. Avery pulled her backpack closer to her feet, eyes never leaving the stranger. His breathing was heavy, his head tilted slightly to one side, chin streaked with dried blood and rain. There was no doubt he was more conscious than when she'd found him, but far from clear-headed. She looked over his clothes again. The white shirt, or what used to be white, was now soaked with dark red stains smeared with mud along the hem. A black designer suit jacket hung over the nearby iron railing, drenched and limp like discarded fabric. His thin-soled leather shoes, expensive ones, were now scuffed and wet with city grime. The man exhaled, his eyes half open. She leaned closer. "Can you hear me?" He blinked. She started to reach for her phone, but he weakly lifted a hand, stopping her. His voice came out between gritted teeth. Don't call an ambulance." The words made Avery freeze. "You're bleeding. You took a hard fall. I need to—" "No, hospital," he muttered, shaking his head, his breath carrying a faint metallic scent. "Just need to sit for a while." Avery tightened her grip on her phone. This time, she could see it clearly, the panic in his eyes. It wasn't pain, it was fear. The kind of fear that made someone refuse an ambulance, refuse a doctor, as if the hospital was somehow worse than lying here, bleeding on the sidewalk. She didn't understand. But she knew that kind of fear, the kind that didn't need explaining. Her past was full of it. Slowly, Avery slid her phone back into her pocket. She glanced around. The convenience store across the street had just opened early. She looked back at the man, then darted across the road. Less than 2 minutes later, she returned with a bottle of water, a small bag of ice, and a few packs of wet tissues. She knelt beside him again, gently lifting his head to rest against her shoulder. She opened a tissue and began wiping the dried blood from his temple. "There. No one's calling an ambulance, but you need to stay steady, okay?" The man didn't speak, just gave a faint nod. Avery helped him to his feet. He was heavier than she'd expected, not just in size, but in the weight of exhaustion hanging off him. After a few unsteady steps, they reached a wooden bench tucked under a narrow awning, just wide enough for the two of them to stay dry. She eased him down onto the seat, wrapped the bag of ice in a tissue, and pressed it gently to his forehead before unscrewing the cap on the water bottle. "Here, drink this, slowly." He took it, both hands still trembling. Avery sat beside him, her heart still racing. Her jeans were soaked up to the knees, her wet hair clinging to her neck. But she didn't care. She checked her watch. 8:02. Late. She knew it. The bookstore was about an 8-minute walk from here. If she left right now, she might make it by 8:10. Not unforgivable, if Mrs. Christine happened to be busy. But looking at the man beside her, gasping for breath, she couldn't make herself stand. "What's your name?" she asked softly. The man looked at her. A pause lingered between them. "Mark," he said finally, without meeting her eyes. "How long were you unconscious?" "Not sure," he murmured. "I remember walking, then everything started spinning." Avery nodded slightly. She didn't ask anything else. Her mind was spinning with silent calculations. Late for work, fired, no rent money, what to eat tonight. But every time she thought about getting up, she saw Mark's breathing grow heavier, his shoulders trembling as if he were holding something in. Then she noticed his hands, fingers curling tight, shaking, gripping hard as if trying to fight off some invisible panic inside him. Avery stepped back, stood, and hurried across the street again, to the same convenience store. This time, she came out with a protein bar and a steaming cup of takeout coffee. When she came back, she handed him the coffee. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. She couldn't tell if it was gratitude or something else, but that look made her feel warm in the cold drizzle. He took a sip, both hands cupping the paper cup as if it were the only solid thing in his world. "Thank you," he murmured, so softly she almost didn't hear it. Avery sat down again, removing the now melted ice pack from his forehead. The bleeding had stopped. The cut wasn't deep, but it would definitely leave a scar. "Do you think you can walk now?" she asked gently, not pushing. "Not yet, just a few more minutes." She nodded. Her watch read 8:11. There was no hope left of keeping her job. This time, she didn't look toward the bookstore at all. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and flipped to the page she'd been writing on. The pencil lines were faint, smudged by moisture. She didn't write anything, just stared at the paper, as if trying to find herself again in a morning that had spun completely out of control. The man sat quietly beside her, his breathing steadying. The drizzle continued to fall, soft and thin. Neither of them spoke. And in that quiet moment, Avery realized she didn't know what she was going to lose today, but at least she had managed to hold on to one thing, the part of her that no hardship could ever take away. When Mark finally gave a small nod, signaling he was all right, Avery stood. She helped him lean back against the bench, checked his wound one last time, then tucked the used tissues into a plastic bag. He said he'd wait until he felt stronger before moving on. She nodded, said nothing, and started walking toward the bookstore. The rain had eased, but the wind hadn't. Her soaked canvas shoes squelched with every step, dragging along the weight of her worry. She didn't dare look at her watch again. When the glass door of the bookstore swung open, The familiar chime sounded colder than usual. Avery stepped inside, her hair plastered to her face, her jacket dripping onto the tiled floor. The air was dry, scented with new paper and weak coffee, normally comforting, but right now it only made her feel more out of place. Mrs. Christine stood behind the counter, taking inventory. The middle-aged woman, with her curled blonde hair and neatly pressed gray suit, glanced at Avery for exactly 3 seconds before setting her pen down. "What time is it now?" Her voice was as cold as the old air conditioner humming in the back room. Avery hurried closer to the counter, her voice hoarse from running and from nerves. "I'm sorry, someone was hurt. I stopped to help him." "Third time this month," Mrs. Christine cut in, not bothering to hear the rest. "And not once were you on time." "I know, but this time it really happened. Someone collapsed right on the street. His head was bleeding. I couldn't just—" "Do you have proof?" Avery stayed silent. It hadn't even crossed her mind to take a photo or record anything. The only thought in her head had been making sure that man didn't collapse again. "No," she said quietly. Christine pulled a printed sheet from the drawer beneath the counter, her eyes never leaving Avery. "You're 37 minutes late. As I stated in your last warning, company policy does not allow 3 violations within 30 days. This is your termination notice." Avery took the paper. Her hands were wet and cold. The edges of the page stuck to the moisture on her fingers. "I'll work extra hours. I'll take the worst shifts. Anything. Just please don't. We need someone reliable, not someone bringing rescue missions to work in the morning," Mrs. Christine said, her face unreadable. Avery swallowed the lump in her throat. She didn't cry, she didn't get angry. She just felt empty. When Mrs. Christine turned back to her stack of ledgers, Avery quietly walked into the break room, opened her locker, and took out her bag. A worn backpack containing a pair of dry socks, her notebook, a crumpled paper bag of broken cookies, and a thin hoodie. She didn't have much to pack. Back at the counter, Avery nodded a quiet goodbye to a coworker standing by the shelves, but the girl only gave a small nod in return, unable to meet her eyes. Avery pulled her hood up and stepped outside. The rain had returned, soft, steady, just like that morning. She didn't bother with an umbrella. She walked toward the nearby park, where stone archways offered a bit of shelter. Her arms wrapped tightly around her backpack, as if it were everything she had left in the world. Rent was due by the end of the week. She had less than $40 in her account. The landlord didn't allow late payments. No family to ask. No one close enough to lend her anything, even for a few days. She sat down on the cold stone steps, the damp seeping through her wet jeans. From her jacket pocket, she pulled out the termination notice and stared at the bold, printed words across the top. 1 more week, just 1, and she would have had enough to pay the fee for her evening writing class at the community center. Her small dream, to write something that was hers. A sound made her lift her head. An older man with a silver beard, holding a leather-bound novel, stood a few steps away. Avery recognized him, one of the bookstore's regulars. He'd often sit for hours in the back corner, reading history books and sipping black tea. He walked closer, didn't ask much, just sat beside her and tilted his large umbrella so it covered them both. "You all right?" His voice was deep, calm, unhurried. Avery nodded, but her lips trembled, her eyes stung, and her throat felt tight like stone. "I just lost my job." "I figured," he said. "Heard the whole thing through the window. It wasn't your fault." Avery turned toward him. He looked at her, not with pity, but with something far gentler, quiet understanding, deeply human. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet, taking from it an ivory-colored business card. "If you ever need help, call me." Avery looked down at the card. It wasn't from the bookstore, nor did it look like one from a bank. Just a simple line of black ink, Bernard Rowe, and beneath it a phone number. Thank you," she stammered. "Not right now," he said. "But don't forget, you're not invisible." He stood, adjusted his sleeve, and left the umbrella with her before walking off into the rain-slicked street, not waiting for an answer. Avery sat there for a while longer, watching the old man disappear beyond the line of trees. The sun had begun to rise behind the gray clouds, but inside her, everything still felt heavy. She tightened her grip on the business card in her hand. It felt fragile, yet real, like a thin thread pulling her back from the edge. But she didn't know what she would call that number for. Didn't know what her next step would be. She only knew one thing. She had nowhere left to go. And for the first time in a long while, that truly scared her. Avery left the park as dusk began to fall. She didn't want to return to the rented room she could no longer afford. If she ran into her landlord, he might bring up last month's overdue rent again. And she couldn't handle another conversation like that. After wandering quietly through the neighborhood for a while, she slipped into the building's shared laundry room in the basement. The small space smelled of detergent and damp air, the door left unlocked by whoever had just used it. A single plastic chair sat by the wall, beside an old dryer humming dully. Avery sat down, clutching her backpack to her chest, eyes closing as exhaustion overtook every thought she had left. She didn't sleep, just drifted in and out, her head nodding in the warmth and hum of the machines. Every time she started to fade, another image surfaced. Mrs. Christine, the termination notice, the empty stare of the girl at the bookstore, the sound of Bernard's footsteps fading away. Near midnight, she sat up and pulled her phone from her backpack. Battery, 17%. Avery scrolled through her contacts, 2 old numbers still saved. The cafe where she'd worked as a waitress a year ago, and the small laundromat where she'd once folded clothes by the hour. She hesitated for a few seconds, then hit call. The cafe picked up after 3 rings. The new manager's voice was brisk. They didn't rehire anyone who'd been gone more than 6 months. The laundromat never answered. She set the phone on her lap and stared at the grimy tile floor. Then, like muscle memory, her mind went to the business card. Avery reached into the small inner pocket of her backpack. It was still there, perfectly dry, even though everything else was damp. She turned it over in her fingers. The fluorescent light glinted faintly across the simple print. Bernard Rowe, Brookline Strategies, and a phone number. Brookline Strategies. She'd never heard the name before. It sounded like a law firm, or maybe an investment company. Whatever it was, it had nothing to do with her. But it was late, and Avery had no one else to call. She dialed the number. 1 ring. 2, 3, 4. No answer. She hung up, pressing the phone to her forehead as if she squeezed a solution out of it. Just as she set it down again, the screen lit up, an incoming call from an unknown number. Avery swallowed hard and answered. Hello. This is Elise from Brookline Strategies. Did you just try calling our office? The woman's voice was calm and polite. Yes, I called because Mr. Bernard gave me his card, and I thought maybe. We've been expecting your call, Elise interrupted, still perfectly courteous. Mr. Rowe sent us your information earlier today. He'd like you to come to the office tomorrow morning to meet with one of our management members. Avery froze, words failing her. Elise, I'm sorry, but I never applied for a job, she said honestly. I know, the woman replied, her tone even. This is a special circumstance. She didn't elaborate. Would you be able to come in at 9 a.m. tomorrow? Yes, Avery said after a beat. I'll be there. Very well. We'll see you on the 25th floor of the Central Point building. Just give your name at the front desk. The call ended. Avery stared at the screen for a few seconds before finally setting the phone down. She didn't understand what was happening, but at this point, she had nothing left to lose. The next morning, she left the laundry room early. The sky was still gray but dry. She put on her last clean pair of jeans, a white blouse, and a simple gray cardigan. Her hair was tied back neatly, and the faded lipstick from yesterday was replaced by a thin layer of balm. She walked a long stretch to the subway station. The morning train was packed with commuters, but she found a spot by the window, clutching her backpack tightly, her mind circling the same question. What do they want from me? After more than 40 minutes, the Central Point building came into view, a towering block of glass rising in the heart of the city, its mirrored surface reflecting the pale silver sky above. It was one of the tallest buildings in the financial district, a place Avery had never imagined herself entering, except maybe as someone passing by. The lobby was lined with marble, the ceiling soaring high enough to make her dizzy. To the left, a sleek cafe buzzed quietly as people in suits murmured over espresso cups. Avery walked to the reception desk, giving her name and reason for coming. Good morning, Miss Morgan. You're expected. Take the elevator on the right to the 25th floor, the receptionist said without looking up from the screen. Avery nodded, her chest heavy as stone. The elevator glided upward, smooth, silent, bathed in soft light. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked small, tense, but steady. She wasn't turning back. When the doors opened, the 25th floor revealed a calm, modern office space. Leather chairs, polished wood floors, and sunlight flooding in through floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Elise, the woman from the night before, greeted her with a gentle smile and a graceful gesture toward a seat. Miss Morgan, thank you for coming. Please have a seat. Someone will meet with you in just a few minutes. Avery sat in the waiting chair, gripping the strap of her backpack. Her heart beat fast, but not with panic. For the first time in days, she felt something was about to change. She didn't know if it would be good or bad. Only that it would be different. The glass door at the far end of the office opened. A tall man stepped out, dressed in a flawless navy suit. Light from the window behind him caught in his neatly cut dark brown hair, formal enough to belong here, but not overly polished. A small medical strip still clung to his forehead, the wound beneath it no longer bleeding. Avery shot to her feet, her pulse pounding like someone had just spoken her real name for the first time in years. It was him, the man from the rainy morning. The one she'd sat beside, trembling as she'd handed him water and tissues. This time he stood straight, steady, his eyes clear and focused on her. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice deep and sure, nothing like the weak whisper she remembered. "Yes," Avery answered, pausing slightly, caught between shock and disbelief. "I'm Simon Caldwell," he said. "Please, come in." The office wasn't as large as she'd imagined, but it was bright and still. An oil painting hung on the wall behind the desk, harsh, sweeping strokes of deep blue and black. Avery didn't study it for long. Her eyes couldn't leave the man now walking toward the desk. "You don't have to look so surprised," he said, catching the confusion still written across her face. "I just didn't expect to see you here," Avery admitted, her hand tightening slightly around her backpack strap. Simon took his seat, fingers interlaced on the glass desk. He nodded once. "I should have said something that day. But honestly, I didn't have the strength. My head was spinning, and to tell the truth, I wasn't even sure where I was." Avery sat down when he gestured, her back straight, the reflex of someone used to defending herself without words. Simon studied her for a few quiet seconds before speaking again. "That morning," Simon began, leaning back slightly, eyes drifting toward the tall glass window. "I'd just come out of a 6-hour meeting. No breaks, barely a moment to breathe. Internal issues, serious ones. I'd been under pressure for 3 straight days. I thought a short walk would help clear my head, get me away from the emails and the reports." He paused, his reflection faint against the glass. Then everything just went dark. I lost feeling in my arm, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground. Avery nodded gently. The image was still vivid in her mind. "If you hadn't stopped, I honestly don't know what would have happened." She didn't know how to respond. Helping someone in trouble had felt instinctive at the time, not heroic. But hearing him say that now made her realize, for the first time, her small act had actually mattered. "I didn't really do much," she said softly. "You did enough to keep me conscious, and to keep me from being hit by another car," Simon replied. "To me, that's more than enough." A brief silence filled the room before he opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. "After you left, I asked our HR department to review the nearby street footage, just to find out who you were. Luckily, a clerk from the convenience store recognized you. That's how we found your name." Avery's eyes widened. She hadn't imagined anyone would go that far just to find her. "I didn't want to make you uncomfortable," he said. "I just felt I needed to do something." Simon slid the folder across the desk toward her. Avery glanced at it. It was a brief file on her. Basic personal details, simple work history, nothing invasive but enough to show he'd actually taken the time to look. "You worked at the bookstore for 8 months, he continued. "Before that, a few part-time jobs. I know you don't have a college degree, but what interests me isn't your resume." Avery looked up, heart beating faster. "We're starting a community project," Simon said, his tone steady but warm, "and I think you might be the right person for a temporary assistant role." "What?" she blurted, caught between confusion and disbelief. "A charitable initiative," Simon explained. "A program to support underprivileged youth, helping them find direction, gain essential skills, and build confidence for the future. I want to bring you onto the initial coordination team." "But I don't have any qualifications," Avery said, shaking her head slightly. "I've never worked in a big office. I don't even really know how a charity project works." Simon smiled then, for the first time since she'd walked in. It wasn't the polite, practiced smile of an executive. It was softer, almost understanding. "I don't need someone who already knows everything," he said. "I need someone who can handle real-life situations, someone who doesn't look away when something's wrong. And most of all, I need someone who genuinely wants to help people. You already have all of that." Avery went still, For the first time in her life, someone was looking at her and seeing more than the empty spaces on her resume. "This isn't a permanent position," Simon went on. "At first, it's just a 3-month contract. We'll train you from the ground up. If things go well, I'm not ruling out something long-term." Avery lowered her head slightly, her hand resting on the edge of the desk. I don't know what to say. I don't understand why you'd want to help me." Simon didn't answer right away. He studied her for a moment, then spoke quietly. "Maybe because, for the first time in years when I fell down, a complete stranger didn't leave me lying there." Avery said nothing more. She just sat there, feeling as if she'd crossed into an entirely new rhythm of life, one where things she'd always thought impossible suddenly felt within reach. All because, once, she chose not to walk away. Simon's last words still echoed in her mind the next morning, as she took her first step into the main workspace of Brookline Strategies. Everything here felt worlds apart from anywhere she'd ever worked before. The open, airy layout, pale wooden floors gleaming under natural light, tailored suits gliding between desks with quiet precision, the steady rhythm of keyboards and the soft, polished hiss of an automatic espresso machine in the corner. Each sound crisp, deliberate, and impossibly refined. Avery moved a little slower than the rhythm of everyone else around her. She wore a crisp white blouse she'd ironed the night before and a pair of black slacks borrowed from a neighbor down the hall. In her hand was the folder Simon had given her. Inside, a temporary access badge and a brief job description. Elise, the woman she'd met on her first visit, greeted her in the side lobby and guided her through a quick tour of the workspace, introducing her to the layout, the workflow, and the team members she'd be working with most often. Elise was professional but not distant. Every so often, her gaze lingered on Avery's face, as if checking how she was holding up in this unfamiliar world. The project Avery had been assigned to was called The Next Chapter, a scholarship initiative aimed at helping young adults who'd grown up in orphanages gain access to education and career training. Under Simon's direct supervision, Avery's role would focus on logistics support, processing applicant information, and helping to develop outreach content for the program. She hadn't expected the project to mirror her own past so closely. Simon never asked what she'd been through in the orphanage. Yet somehow, he always gave her tasks that struck a perfect balance, challenging enough to push her, but never to the point of breaking. No needless pressure, no impossible tests, just quiet, steady trust. The first few team meetings had terrified Avery, but over time, through careful note-taking, meticulous preparation, and Simon's habit of backing her ideas when others doubted, she began to feel that she actually belonged. Still, not everyone in the office welcomed her so easily. The first to show open irritation was Jared Lindley, head of internal marketing. In his early 30s, with a resume boasting 2 major ad agencies before joining Brookline, he'd long been seen as a rising contender for upper management. Avery's sudden arrival, and the fact that she worked directly with Simon, was something Jared couldn't hide his irritation about. In meetings, his smile was strained. He'd question her suggestions even when they were clear, and once, he'd even muttered with a smirk, "Looks like we're recruiting interns off the street now, huh?" Avery heard him, but she didn't respond. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she'd met people like Jared before, people who lived comfortably within their privilege and feared being overshadowed. Still, the curious glances around the office began to multiply. She overheard small conversations near the coffee station, half jokes and vague questions about the new girl who had no formal application, no public interview, and yet somehow landed a spot right under the director's wing. Avery didn't answer anyone. She simply kept her head down and worked, building contact lists for community partners, drafting ideas for outreach content, helping refine the scholarship evaluation criteria. Whenever Avery hesitated over something, Simon was always willing to pause and explain. He never dictated or corrected to assert authority. Instead, he gave her the freedom to ask questions, and, most importantly, he listened. One afternoon during lunch break, Avery found him sitting alone on the rooftop terrace. He handed her a cup of hot tea and said quietly, "I know not everyone is going to accept the way you came here, but I don't need their approval. I just need them to see results." That line stayed with Avery all through the afternoon. It didn't erase Jared's cold stares, but it helped her breathe easier whenever she had to sit beside him during project briefings. She didn't know when Jared had started digging into her background. But one day, While passing the print room, she overheard her name through the half-open door. Jared on the phone, thinking no one else was nearby. No degree, no official file, and no traceable history. Who is she? And why the hell was she dropped straight into this place? Avery stopped walking. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time in years, she realized she didn't want to run from who she was anymore. She turned away without a word, showing no sign she'd overheard anything. But inside, she knew. Her being here was no longer some stroke of luck. It was a challenge, and she had no intention of backing down. The whispers around the office didn't fade after that call in the print room. The skeptical glances, the half-hearted nods, the quiet, "Who is she, really?" that trailed behind her down the hall, all of it became part of her daily routine. Avery was used to being judged without being asked. That didn't mean it stopped hurting. That Monday, the Next Chapter team had an extended meeting with several department heads. The conference room on the 23rd floor had wide glass walls overlooking the hazy morning skyline. Avery arrived 10 minutes early, ready to present her progress report on the community organizations she'd contacted that week. She checked her slides on the projector, adjusted the chairs, and neatly arranged a printed handout for each attendee. Every page aligned, every detail double-checked, her nervous energy channeled into quiet precision. Simon entered a few minutes later, followed by Jared, Elise, and 4 mid-level managers from HR, communications, finance, and partnerships. The atmosphere at first was cordial, brief greetings, polite smiles, before everyone took their seats and the room settled into the hum of routine professionalism. The meeting began with Avery's presentation. She stood, keeping her focus forward, deliberately not looking in Jared's direction. Her voice was steady and clear as she walked through the project's progress. Statistics, outreach charts, partnership proposals, all laid out with precision. Elise nodded several times in approval, while Simon sat motionless, fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed on Avery. When she finished, Jared cleared his throat and leaned forward, his posture radiating the kind of eagerness that made everyone else instinctively tense. "Thank you, Miss Morgan, for that overview," he began, his tone smooth as syrup, but his eyes ice cold. "I just have one small question, purely for transparency's sake." Avery sat down, spine still straight. Jared lifted a thin stack of papers, holding it up like a courtroom exhibit. "We all know this initiative targets underprivileged youth. But has anyone here wondered why the assistant project role wasn't filled through a formal hiring process? Or why Miss Morgan, who now holds a key position, has no college degree, has been unemployed for months, and in fact grew up in the state foster system?" The room fell into a silence so sharp it felt like it might shatter. Jared leaned back in his chair, a faint, self-satisfied smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he'd just delivered a final, irrefutable blow. Avery felt the heat rush to her face, but she didn't look down. She met Jared's gaze, steady and unflinching, then slowly turned toward Simon. No one else spoke. The only sounds in the room were the soft hum of the air conditioner and the steady thump of her heartbeat in her ears. Simon rose to his feet, not hurriedly, not angrily. But the shift in the room was immediate. Every head turned toward him. "I'm actually glad Jared brought that up," Simon said, resting one hand lightly on the edge of the table. "Because if he hadn't, I was planning to share this story myself today." Jared froze, clearly not expecting that response. Simon took a few steps forward, facing the group squarely. "Last week, I spoke with the executive board about why this project, the Next Chapter, has to be more than a strategy. It has to be human. And the reason I trust Miss Morgan isn't because of her resume. It's because 3 weeks ago, I collapsed on a sidewalk, and she's the one who stopped to help me." A collective stir rippled through the room as several people looked up, stunned. "I lost consciousness for several minutes from a sudden drop in blood pressure," Simon continued, his voice even, but carrying through the room. "Cars passed by. People glanced and kept walking. She was the only one who stopped. She didn't know who I was. She wasn't afraid of the inconvenience. She didn't take a photo, didn't post it online. She stayed. She covered me with her jacket, bought water, cleaned the wound, and refused to leave until I could stand again." The room was utterly silent. "No one in this room has ever had their compassion tested in that kind of moment," Simon said, his tone calm, steady. "But she has, and she passed." He looked around, not accusingly, just laying the truth on the table. "I don't need ideal employees. I need people who understand why we do what we do. And no one understands that better than someone who's lived it." No one spoke. Jared stared down at the table, his fingers twitching slightly. And for that reason, Simon went on, starting next week, Avery Morgan will officially serve as project coordinator for the next chapter. Her contract will move to full-time status, with her own workspace and a dedicated sub-team budget. Elise smiled faintly. A few others nodded automatically, still processing what they'd just heard. Then Simon turned to Jared. As for you, Jared, I believe the Westside Regional Outreach Division is still looking for a new team lead. I'll have HR coordinate the details. I trust you'll bring the same dedication there that you've shown to transparency here. Jared's face went pale. He said nothing, just gave a stiff, reluctant nod. The meeting ended. People filed out one by one, the room heavy with silence. Avery stayed seated for a few seconds longer before she could move. She didn't look at Jared or anyone else, but for the first time in her life, she walked out of her room not with fear, but with something she'd never quite felt before. The quiet certainty of being seen, fully, without having to hide any part of who she was. 2 months later, Avery's mornings began in a small wooden-floored kitchen, sunlight pouring through the wide window that overlooked the park. The apartment was modest, just 2 rooms, but it was hers. Enough space for a few framed prints she loved, a short bookshelf, and a cactus perched on the sill. Gone were the rushed dinners in the dark, the sound of wind seeping through damp, cracked walls. Here, she'd found a kind of silence that wasn't loneliness. It was peace. Each morning, she still faced the mirror, a habit from her old life, but now it was to see the change. Not the clothes, not the faint color on her lips, but the eyes that no longer looked away. The woman staring back knew exactly what she was doing, where she was going, and, finally, why. Avery was no longer just a project coordinator. She was the bridge connecting dozens of community organizations, the voice behind heartfelt outreach letters drawn from her own experience, the mentor who stood before groups of young people and spoke in a steady, honest voice, the words she once needed to hear at 16. Her connection with Mr. Bernard remained steady. They met for tea once a month at a small cafe on the ground floor of an old building near the bookstore. One afternoon, between sips of Earl Grey, Avery finally asked, "Why did you give me that card that day? How did you know?" Bernard smiled, folding his newspaper neatly before answering, as if the question had been waiting for its moment. "Simon called me right after he got home," he said. "Told me to give the card to the person who made him wake up again." "And me?" He chuckled softly. "I was just doing my part, the messenger who showed up at the right time." Avery laughed softly, her heart light as an autumn breeze. Sometimes, fate didn't need to shout or stage grand drama. It only needed one nod, one outstretched hand, and that was enough to turn an entire life in a new direction. On the day of the official launch for the Youth Empowerment Fund, Avery wore a simple deep blue dress, her hair neatly tied back, standing behind the curtain of a large community center auditorium. She wasn't nervous. She had rehearsed her speech a dozen times. Yet, when the lights came up and she stepped onto the stage, seeing hundreds of faces looking back at her, her breath caught for just half a second. Then she smiled. "I used to believe some mornings could ruin your whole life," she began, her voice steady and clear without needing much amplification. "I used to think that losing the one job you had meant losing everything that came with it." A brief pause. "But one morning, I stopped to help a man who had collapsed on the street. I was late, I lost my job, I lost my home, and then I found out who I really was." Avery paused again, not looking down at her notes but out into the front row, where Simon and Bernard sat side by side. "That day, I thought it was the worst day of my life. Turns out, it was the beginning of everything good that came after." Applause rose like a soft wave, filling the room with warmth instead of noise. Avery tilted her head in a quiet bow. There was nothing left to fear. Nothing left to hide. She had walked through her past, and now she was writing her own future.